welcome to Varn Blog. And today we have Zara and Sher?
Yeah.
Make sure I pronounce your name right. I don't want to like butcher anyone's nomenclature. And I will. So
It's all good.
And they're of the relatively new, about a year old, Facing Autonomy podcast and project. And I'm going to let them introduce what they do for you. I will just say that I've known Zara online for about 5 years. So it's been a little while, but your project came up during COVID, and I guess you guys have been releasing monthly, right? Roughly ish.
Yeah, it's been slow. I mean, it's partially my fault. Like, I think like it's just the overall, situation, politically and in the US and just generally when it comes to sort of, radical politics, it's just, sometimes you need to take a break and reassess and just always constantly question, right? And think about new strategies, tactics, and, what we want to contribute to, or, what we stand for. And that's constantly a process we go through internally, just having those discussions, and learning from each other. I think that's like the most important thing.
Right. And the podcast came about, we were inspired by reading some CLR James's writing, which was departing from the Trotskyist formula and was going more toward council communism and Marxist humanism. And we were also inspired by the autonomist political movement, which, several of us got excited by the pieces of it, which have remained radical over the years. And I was glad to see, Varn, you did a nice podcast about the autonomous movement with P.H. Higgins a couple months back, which I feel like you also considered the radical potential of that movement that inspired us as well.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by autonomism, and I'm actually interested. There seems to always be something hot in the left communist tradition and in the Anglosphere, but it changes as to what it is. So right now, like, I guess maybe because of memes, Bordigism has been kind of the kind of de rigueur intellectual radical tradition that people have picked up from Italian left communism. And interestingly enough, I didn't explore autonomism very thoroughly for a long time, actually, because when I was being radicalized in the late 90s, early aughts, it was the de rigueur one, and I was exposed to late Nagiri and rolled my eyes a lot, and I mean, and only through going through the various Italian movements that I really see how important Autonomia and Apparismo really was. I come out of a Marxist humanist tradition. I wouldn't call myself one anymore. But so I'm familiar with CLR James, and particularly in the period that you're talking about, which is that period where we're moving into breaking away from Trotskyism, but we haven't gone into third worldism yet, which is later James and Grace Lee Boggs and that. So I'm also very influenced by those things, but I'm interested because you guys don't consider yourselves Marxist, right? You wouldn't necessarily identify as that, or somewhere in between.
Do you want to go first, Sher?
No, you can go first.
I mean, speaking for myself, my radicalizing trajectory was that I started out somewhat anarchist, and that I went through a phase, which is I think the time when I met you, Varn. I went through a phase where I was interested in Bordiga about 4 or 5 years ago, and then since then I kind of had this realization that the Bordiga crew didn't have any clear ideas about praxis necessarily, or they had varying ideas, but there was not a lot of agreement about what kind of praxis they thought was cool. And so that got me more moving back into a series of Marxist and anarchist ideologies, which are syncretic with one another and are open to varying types of praxis, not limited to insurrectionary ideas, syndicalist ideas, certain types of autonomist ideas, and also council communist sort of ideas. And after my break with Bordigism, I became more interested in council communism because I felt like it was a more practically pragmatic approach to what Bordiga wanted to achieve without this obsession with this party form, which I could never get so super excited about among the Bordigist crowd. And so Facing Autonomy is kind of the constellation of my radical development as far as remaining a communizer in my thinking, but wanting to mix Marxism and anarchist ideas about tactics and about what program and historical analysis, as well as mixing the more radical sides of identity-based critique, which I have remained a defender of despite people in the left-com world being rather critical of liberal identity politics for, I think, good reason, but sometimes they took it too far to critique people who are not liberals who are interested in identity issues.
I just wanted to say it's always hard to follow up, coming from my background, I think my experience as a political organizer and someone, after, the return of so-called democracy in 2008, 2009, there was an effort by, various young organizers to sort of, create a sort of left opposition in Pakistan. And, at the time within, each city, there was a very limited sort of understanding. There was a huge old tradition of Stalinism and Maoism and third worldism. But I think, and then obviously, Trotskyite sort of theories were also there. But I think, to a larger extent, they had, these sort of, old left, you could call them, they were sort of very disconnected from the existing class struggles that were taking place in society. So we were sort of, looking at something, like a Syriza sort of party, and we created this Awami Workers Party in Pakistan, which is short for People's Workers Party. And it was there, you start to, when you're in positions of responsibility, when you're organizing and trying to, with unions, you're seeing these huge radical unions who were influential in the 60s, their rapid decline. And then, and then you also saw the limitations of the old left in their strategic sort of maneuvers, because, they were sort of concerned with the intra-party struggle more so than anything else. And I feel one of the main crises today is sort of, the lack of center, right? When there was the Soviet Union or, especially in the third world, Maoism was really influential, especially in South Asia. Those traditions were there, but there's also a disconnect when we talk about these labels and the context in which, we're talking about Bordigism or, even autonomy for that, autonomia for that matter, whether it's Tronti, Tronti never really left the Communist Party. And I think, we see it's really hard to sort of create a label for, everything, where do we stand? But yeah, I'm totally with Zara on this. I'm interested in, insurrectionary ideologies, and, anarchism, autonomism, Marxism even, and I think there's a lot we can learn from this, but I think that, there's a sort of, disconnect about what is to be done. And, especially with the new internet spatialities, right? You see a sort of assumption of, you know, radical thought going on, you know, at this, like, you know, the sphere we're taught, you know, the spatiality that we're engaging with right now, which is like podcasts and YouTube and those things. And I think it's done a great job to educate people. There's no doubt, but there's also, you know, it makes you wonder why, you know, makes you question and wonder why the left lost its sort of ability to engage with the working class at a certain level. And I think, like, you know, and I feel like this is where autonomism and, you know, new tactics and new strategies are really important, because, you know, there is a certain amount of, you know, we have to understand new forms of class struggle and new forms of self-organization that are taking place, you know, within society. And each place, I think it's like different. There is no like center, there is no sort of, you know, internationalism or anything like that. I shouldn't say there isn't, there are, you know, there is obviously, but there is a certain disconnect, you know, and you see that disconnect, you know, in multiple forms, you know, when you're talking about like what happened in Chile, like, you know, the sort of, it wasn't a united left sort of project which allowed them to remove the military laws, and you know, the sort of, you know, organizing by students, the organizing in sort of slum areas, shanty towns, those sort of communities was sort of, and the feminist movement was really instrumental in challenging very authoritarian sort of states. And coming from my context in Pakistan as well, you sort of see that. And I just wanted to add that I also think, you know, like one thing we don't talk about is, you know, the underlying violence of capitalism, right? You know, capitalism is not just a system of extraction anymore. It hasn't ever been. It's underlined by a certain sort of violence, right? Which isn't just like sovereign power, but it's also, you know, sort of like, you know, like a control society sort of argument that's coming about. And how do we sort of think about these things, you know, like, you know, organizing in the workplace, organizing in communities, creating dual power in communities, and actually sort of, you know, instigating sort of radical movements. I think like there is definitely an political party sort of thing, but I don't think like people are necessarily against like serious radical organizations, like you know, whether it's the IWW or like those sort of organizations, which, you know, sort of you know, are still committed to the idea of organization or like programmatic sort of politics. Because, you know, like on an everyday level, like, you know, if I'm in Pakistan, like a lot of my friends, they're facing sedition cases, they're facing, you know, a lot of pressures, which I don't think, you know, it's really hard to, you know, connect that. And, you know, the labels are different, the ways of articulating that politics is different. And I do think they're obviously, like, you know, when you're in a situation, right, you know, it's a lot harder to sort of, you know, like sort of think about that. But for me, like, autonomism is about recognizing, you know, like we got to support different forms of class struggle within society, right? Different movements, different those things. But it's also about, you know, like, you know, just like sort of, you know, taking, you know, getting your hands dirty. You know, politics, the political is not supposed to be a sort of neat and sort of, am I saying it right? Like neat sort of, you have to get your hands dirty. You know, it's never going to be like a sort of clean sort of process. You can start off saying you're going to do something, but when you're in a situation and the state's cracking down on you or your friends are going to jail, you know, like it's a whole different context. And I think, you know, that's something that has to be thought about. And I think, you know, the US also, you know, has a, you know, we've seen a lot of things happening over the last year, but I think that there hasn't been a sort of attempt to sort of reconcile sort of the contradictions of those sort of, you know, things. I don't know, like, you know, these questions of what is to be done. And if there is a sort of, you know, like, are we going to be limited to sort of discussions, right? And are we going to be limited to sort of, fall into the trap of like liberal assumption and compromise and those sort of things in that sense?
In the case of the United States, the answer to that at the moment seems clearly yes. But yeah, that is a good segue into getting a little bit more specific. We have seen during the U.S. is increasingly focused on the DSA. Its growth was rampant from 2016 to 2019. It slowed during the Bernie movement. Bernie's capitulation saw it move again about 20 to 25,000 more paper members. However, and increasingly I hear arguments for the left liquidating itself into the DSA for whatever reason. One thing I will say about that is to start off our questions, however, is what the DSA is, what it stands for, and what it actually does, in my mind, has never been less clear than it is right now under Biden. And I would like you guys to maybe disaggregate a little bit what we mean. What do you see going on since the left has moved from opposition to Trumpism to dealing with whatever the current status quo is? And then maybe what do we think the current status quo actually is?
Well, to speak for myself, I haven't really agreed with people that the DSA is where we should be focusing our time. I've spent a little bit of time in it briefly. I found it to be pretty useless, and I've been organizing in the IWW, which has quite different issues, but has also been an organization which people have put a lot of energy into in the United States since the 90s. Even though right now it's not as hip. With a certain number of people who are podcasting or whatever, or is not in Jacobin or whatever you have. And I noticed in the IWW that there are several factions, and one faction is obsessed with workplaces, and the other faction is more interested in a range of willingness to interface with identity movement, willingness to do a lot of random different types of things, ranging from, say, mutual aid to solidarity with certain types of protests by specific minority groups in certain places, and so I feel like a similar struggle is at work in the DSA crowd, in that you have, and this is something that you've talked about in your own podcast, is that there's kind of a liberal side of the DSA which is interested in identity issues, and there's a liberal side of the DSA which is less interested in identity issues, and they're kind of battling it out. And I see the same thing happening in the IWW, and both sides have their various forms of liberalism in that, in the IWW of people who are more workplace oriented, who don't believe general strikes are real, whereas in the identity side you have people who want to make the organization about doing what nonprofits do. And I think both sides of that group are not great. And this again gets back to stuff you were saying in one of your recent podcasts, Varn, about that same kind of dualism going on in the DSA, where you have the liberal identity crowd and the liberal class first crowd, if you will. And so I think that those divisions in the community are going to reassert themselves over and over again until we can accept that we're not gonna have a democratic centralist American left, that we're going to have several decentralist groups which are going to be doing different things. And if only people who are on the further left can accept that there's not going to be just a DSA, there's not going to be just one organization, there's going to be a bunch of groups that are going to disagree on things, and that's going to be the reality for a long time, and we have to deal with decentralization not as something that can't be corrected, but as something to use. And so I guess that's my suggestion of how to deal with the DSA issue is the DSA should become more decentralized. It should give more power to the regional chapters. I see local regional chapters of the DSA being more radical than the national DSA, just similar to the IWW in that way, in that local chapters of the organizations have more autonomy, can do more independently, and the national organization does a good job of pacifying what is done. And I'm sure Sher will have some interesting parallels with Pakistan on these issues.
I mean, there's so many parallels. I mean, DSA isn't just, democratic socialism isn't just a sort of, isn't something that developed in the post-crisis period or something like that. It's always been there in the US, especially in the 70s. You had democratic students. And I think, one of the major issues has been like the class composition of these sort of organizations and sort of appropriation of certain discourse, which does not match what it's doing on the ground. I think, I could go on hating on, what are the shortcomings and those things. But I think one thing is that, I see it as, related to the crisis of Marxism. I see it as related to the crisis of communism. What is our politics and what do we stand for? And I think DSA, especially during the democratic socialism, especially during the civil rights movement, had a really different sort of impact, and I think one of the shortcomings in their tactics is they sort of have depended heavily on students, the campus. It sort of has it got related to that. I think that's one thing. And then, its inability to break into sort of working class areas and sort of, develop a base in, actual, working class communities and sort of create solidarities in those areas. And I think, the other thing is there's another element to this, like the collapse of the ISO. It sort of has inculcated a lot of those practices, the Tony Cliff sort of Trotskyism. And I think there are a lot of shortcomings in that because, firstly, and then there's, the question of nonviolence as a sort of starting position, I think that is another thing that, I think that is misread. There's a disconnect between the movements which have taken place over the last year or two, whether it was in Minnesota, George Floyd, or, in Portland or other places. And, I think there is, it's just something, I think that, what they're good at is local body elections, right? Essentially, they've been able to get, a couple of people elected into city council, from what I understand. They're able to do very civil society sort of protests, right? And then the glaring silence on certain questions that were taking place over the last 2 years has been, something that's disappointed people as well, I think, in that sense. And, but yeah, I could go on about this.
I'm gonna piece some of this apart because I think there's about 5 different themes I heard in this one, and all of them are kind of useful to talk about in and of themselves. And I think the biggest one would be, right now, there's a debate about the absence of the working class in the American left, or even what that working class is and means. This has led to this debate about the professional managerial class, which I have on record as saying that in 90% of the times I hear it defined, it's not a meaningful distinction. And by that, I mean, when people say PMC, they can mean anyone who holds any kind of formal education, which since the 60s would be 40 to 60% of the workforce of any, across the board. It can mean people with a fiduciary responsibility to clients who may or may not be petit bourgeois, and the only reason you wouldn't call them petit bourgeois is some of them are technically employees, and that category may exist, right? That's a real thing. But that's not who is running the left. So bringing it up in relation to, like, it's not like the left is run. Maybe there's no representation of lawyers in the NGO section of the left. I mean, I would say that's probably true, but that doesn't even explain the Democratic Party. If you add tech workers into that, it gets very complicated. I believe it was actually on a Regrettable Century podcast was doing on their Patreon feed a discussion of nihilist communism by Marshall Dupont. And they pointed out that by the definition given in Malcolm of working class, which is not a definition I actually agree with, but I'm just going to, that working class proletarian means you can shut down the economy, excuse me. Tech workers actually count because they can, in a way that, to be honest, certain sectors of service workers or people we traditionally think of as blue collar cannot. That's an interesting problem that I think the current left doesn't know how to deal with because it hasn't thought about the modern economy really. It has bypassed those difficulties, in my mind, by focusing almost solely on representative identity politics. And I'm going to say representative on purpose. Because Zara, you know me, I used to be rabidly anti-ID poll. And before Trump even, I started, I think actually around the time I met you, I started to pull away from a lot of that because I was seeing these trends that reminded me of paleoconservatism, but also were positing this like collective worker that didn't exist. Right? Like this like factory worker, blue collar, white male shit kicker, basically, that like wasn't a statistical reality for most, proletarian people in the developed world, or frankly, even into the quote developing world anymore. I mean, I don't think even third worldists haven't dealt with how much automation has affected the third world worker, the quote third world worker, right? It's a much bigger deal than people realize. So that's one thread, and I think that's important. Another thread I heard is the DSA structure is fascinating to me because what the DSA locals do is mostly mutual aid. I don't know what the mutual aid, I mean, ostensibly it's mutual aid to get people to join the DSA. It's very churchy, but that's the majority of what they do. But what the DSA spends the majority of its money on is consultants and its own internal staff. I actually got, I went and looked this up. You can find the percentages of what they spend their money on one of their Patreon accounts. It's not easy to find. But only 20% of the national dues goes back to locals. Most of the national dues go straight into to paid staff, and weirdly, a whole lot of it goes into consultants. For what? It doesn't say. So that's a big issue with the DSA right there. Another thing I was going to say, you said they're good at getting people elected at local election levels. They are in places where a shoe can run as a Democrat, or in kind of reddish states where there's dissatisfaction with both parties. However, so far, most of those people who are not in safe Democratic districts only last one term and are often disaffiliated by the DSA itself before they even finish their term out. That's been the trend I'm seeing right now. It is also, interesting to me when we talk about the DSA, how we give them credit for like the 6 people roughly related to the squad. Because I think 3 or 4 of them were formerly parts of the DSA at one point or another. But the DSA has no pull or check on them in any way, form, or fashion. I mean, they don't have any way to hold them accountable to the DSA itself. And I mean, I don't want to sound like Jimmy Dore because, you know, his politics are shit for ways we can talk about too as another reaction to all this. It's not helpful, but Dore has been right that like a lot of what the squad has been doing has been raising funds for the entire progressive caucus, including people who have very little overlap with the Democratic Socialist agenda, and also, frankly, the entire even conservative Democrats to make sure that they can hold the House and Senate. So that's interesting to me too. There's something though I wanted to bring up that is implied by something that you said, Shar, in the beginning, but we haven't discussed yet. And the ISO's liquidation and the Trotskyist liquidation in general, because I also suspect a lot of the ire aimed at Kasama Sawat from the DSA right now is to try to get SALT to liquidate into it as well. We've also seen their dim-sum prohibitions only used against Trots, but they work with and have in them tons of Marxist-Leninists and Marxist-Leninist Maoists now. Now, on a lot of people talk about left unity, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about, actually, a little bit more about autonomy in this regard, is that there seems to be that the DSA thinks its growth strategy is to try to pull people away from groups like the FRSO or the PSL. As a growth strategy, that means that they've given up on recruiting from normal people and non-leftist. I mean, even normal student groups, like that's not like they seem to think they may be at capacity with that for a while. And so you've seen a lot more, like there's a lot more tolerance of groups that are just as guilty of democratic centralism and other behaviors like that as the Trots, but are Stalinist, are Maoist, and are seen as being more conducive towards left unity for reasons that I don't entirely understand. So would you guys like to speak to any of that, peeps? Like, you got anything on, on any of those three terms? Because that's what I pulled away from what you started with. There's a whole lot there.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that everything you're highlighting there is really important, and I think the autonomists are relevant. You know, there's a reason why they're coming up right now in response to all of this, because the autonomists were people who really questioned the idea of the mass worker, as you said, the idea that there's this archetypal like factory worker who's the base of the working class. And, you know, that idea has been all over the left, like the Soviet Union's, you know, sickle and hammer was an archetypal version of this kind of image of the mass worker, which has been, you know, around. And, you know, one of Sher and I, before we started the Facing Autonomy podcast, we were really interested in education workers, you know, because we're both graduate students, PhD students to be exact, you know, and we wanted to have a discourse privately, which never kind of took wing, about student organizing, you know, and that kind of work has not kind of taken on a lot of, it hasn't become a big part of Facing Autonomy, but I am now working, I am organizing with the IWW in a group, a committee called the EWOC, the Education Workers Organizing Committee. And so that has inspired me. And so that's also germane to this topic of like, who is the left? And I think that increasingly now, you get a lot of education workers, even grad students who are the left, especially adjuncts, especially people who in part-time education work, who don't have any stability, who are in a precarious situation, you know, and the autonomists were people who brought precarity up, you know, and they brought up immaterial labor, you know, and so they were already asking questions about different kinds of labor, different types of work, which exists in you know, and I know neoliberalism is criticized on the left for saying that capitalism is changing. Of course, capitalism has remained the same, but there's a certain use in not in the idea of neoliberal as far as a regime of capital, the neoliberal regime of capital, that has been what has presided over the loss of the mass worker, if you will, in a certain way. And so the autonomists are really important in appearing during that rise of the neoliberal regime and really saying, hey, the working class is much different now, and we can't stick to the old symbols of the working class anymore. And so I think that that's the answer to your first question. And about mutual aid, I think the same is largely true about the IWW, as far as most chapters being mutual aid or oriented, and only a few chapters really doing what the organization pins itself on, which is, in the IWW's case, that's unionizing, but of course, we know in the DSA's case, that's these local elections, or that's its supposed influence, which I think you've already deconstructed as not being true. It's supposed influence on national politicians. So I agree with you that both these organizations are not accepting that maybe we have a moment which calls for decentralized, not a centralization of the working class or of the left, but a decentralized left. And I think the autonomists were also people that were okay with the idea of a decentralized left, that didn't think of splitting as something that was disastrous, or they didn't idealize the liquidation of all these organizations and people within one organization. So those are two threads that really resonate for me. And of course, the PMC idea is this wildly shifting goalpost depending on who's talking about it, and so there is no single idea of a PMC. Those were the ones that stuck out to me. Did you have?
No, those are the big ones. One thing I'll say though, really quickly, I used to think this Stalinism thing that we saw was a solely internet phenomenon, right? I no longer think that. I think it is a hyper marginal phenomenon, even beyond that. But 3% of the population in a country of 320 million is still a fuck ton of people. So like, I think that and what changed me this is there were two groups that I encountered in real life that I thought didn't actually, I mean, I knew the PSL existed because I dealt with them before, but when I was younger and when I first dealt with the PSL, it was when I was first going into grad school, and I was actually pretty conservative at the time, and I dealt with them because of the fallout over International Ouncer, and they split with the WWP, and hit all their Trotskyist roots, et cetera, and so forth, right? And yes, Virginia, the PSL, if does not have Trotskyist roots themselves, the party that they split from does. So that's a great irony of history that I love to point out. But I didn't encounter them much outside of anti-war activist groups and some third-party stuff, and specifically in California. About 3 years ago, that changed. Like I noticed the PSL was everywhere, and particularly actually in big cities that were liberal in red states. I don't know why, but it's a trend. And then another group that I encountered in the in-person world that I really thought was an online phenomenon was Black Hammer. We had a friend who worked with us and actually in immigrant advocacy. It was a mixture of Marxist liberals and anarchists who did specific mutual aid / lawyer adjacent stuff. And one of our more Marxist-y people first started flirting with the PSL, then started turning all of the meetings into like, this is going to sound insulting, and I don't entirely mean it to be, but like church sessions for the greater contradiction according to Mao, and then joined Black Hammer and was actively, just trying to blow up organizations. And I assumed, again, this was an internet primary phenomenon, but it isn't. It is absolutely not. One of the things I would say that as a result of that is this person has foregone their formal education to devote their lives to revolutionary struggle. In the case of the Black Hammer organization. Now, that bugs me. Any person of color who is started a, the educational process, who leaves it for something that's probably not going to work, is actually paying an even higher social and future costs than if a white student does that, frankly. And I actually started worrying that, like, I used to joke about the children's crusade of Marxism, but I actually started seeing it in IRL. What do you think is driving this right now? And is it a response to the fact that we don't seem to be able to handle decentralization? Is it a response to the fact that we can't imagine something that is ribosomatically, to use an obnoxious word from delusion theory, which I normally hate, ribosomatically organized with multiple nodes, which is maybe not quite as efficient, but is less brittle? What do you think is driving that obsession right now? Because it's become an obsession of the left. And I actually personally take it as a sign that we're about to see a decline in overall left action. So
I think Sher should talk about this because he's encountered those people in Pakistan. Go ahead, Sher.
Well, I mean, you could just read Murray Bookchin's Listen Marxist from 1971, what took place after the 60s and how the discourse of Cater, democratic centralism just suddenly reappeared into the discourse of the left, and, the basis of, radical struggle, was co-opted and, subsumed by these like sort of groups that were working, with interventionism and other tactics, and, they lost, it's just, yeah, I mean, I was just pulling up, Listen Marxist. The beginning part of this is kind of interesting because, and it relates to the fact, I personally feel that it relates, this has always been there, since, the time of Lenin. Bordiga was essentially, within that context, like, the debate was around United Left tactics. It was about, what is to be done, this idea of the professional revolutionary. What has happened is that you don't have the same, like Lenin was very simple about what the cater was. It was like, in a time of extreme crisis, when the state is cracking down on you and the capitalists are cracking down on you, you have to have, a magazine, a publication outlet. A cater was essentially a conscious work, a conscious party worker, right? Like essentially and that type of thing. And I think, these it's just like, it's just the whole compromise factor, like social democracy. You saw it with Rosa Luxemburg, right? Like Rosa Luxemburg was, hung by essentially a social democratic government backed by the Soviet Union, like, and it was the precursor to, I think, the fascism that came afterwards. And, we should really think about the questions of why the working class or working class areas, or, why the left, has become sort of situated around the campus. And this infatuation with, like I heard the guy from, not Jacobin, but, the guy from New York, the professor, what's his name, the DSA intellectual, he was like, I wanted
Sankara, or
okay, no, his advisor, I think,
Vivek Chibbers.
Yeah, Vivek Chibber, like he was like, my wife was in the, Communist Party of India and, like JNU and this, that, but the type of violence that, like, it's not like a game, like you don't train sort of people from the universities and send them out into working class communities. That's not a strategy or a tactic or anything like that. For me, it's more important to understand, the actions that are happening, what people are doing, like the tenant strikes, right? Like in the US, I'm trying to relate it to the US context, like the tenant strikes, or, you know, different things like that are taking place. And I think, like, you know, US has its own context because obviously the racial history, you know, IWW, its long legacy. I think like IWW's history is very compelling because they were able to organize in spaces that other people were not able to organize in. And, you know, and the question of Black workers, right? And those sort of things. So like, I think like over here, you know, the white, you know, like sort of blue collar sort of fascination with the blue collar worker on a certain level sort of is like over determined in the sense that it doesn't recognize like how diverse and how heterogeneous, you know, like, you know, like various communities are in that sense. So like, you know, I personally feel like it's, you know, this compromise that takes place, and it happened in '68, you know, like in Europe, you know, when the Communist Party or the Social Democratic government did an alliance with the Christian Democrats, right? The people on the ground were left like, you know, like the students and workers were able to take control of the factories and sort of make de Gaulle leave, right? But then the Communist Party was the one that sort of reached a deal with the Christian Democrats, right? And, you know, like, and so, I mean, like, this has been like, you know, a long-standing history, and it sort of continues. And I think like over here, what happened was like the ideas that were coming out of Occupy, right? It was those that got like caught up in this. And I think like, you know, Occupy, I see its roots like going back to like '99, sort of Seattle, Battle for Seattle sort of stuff, right? Like those sort of things, those sort of actions, right? And Battle for Seattle would not have occurred without the like multitude of actions that were taking place at those times. And I think like there is a, you know, like this is just something that has happened like countlessly. We've seen John Lewis, you know, we saw Stokely Carmichael and the Black nationalists and the Black Power movement sort of on a separate level, right? And the way sort of they went, and then we saw John Lewis like take the whole student movement, you know, like a major portion of that student movement into the thing, right? Into the Democratic Party, right? The Democratic Convention. There are videos of this stuff, right? You should, we can walk and we can watch them, and we can see, you know, like what was the discourse being, what were the conversations, tactical conversations that were happening at that period. And, you know, and the thing people don't realize is that with the union movement as well, like over here, they were extrajudicially killed, right? Basically, they were violently put down, right? Like, and that violence has never been sort of no one tried to understand that. Why was the Black Power? Why were leaders of the Black Power movement extrajudicially killed in the U.S.? You know, why were, you know, like. And there were so many radical projects. Radical Ferries is another project, right? There are probably problems with that as well. But I mean, like if you look at the context of, you know, like not hot autumn, but like the sort of AIDS epidemic and that stuff, like it was a very, very radical concept when it came about, you know. And these sort of alternative social projects, you know, I'm using like academic language right now, but like these sort of like, you know, we got to be looking towards these and sort of, you know, thinking about like, you know, how do we sort of connect, unify with those grassroots movements on the ground, like, and try to go towards that. I don't think like, you know, like, yeah, it's just unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate because there's so many limitations that come when you privilege certain people over others, and your organizational setup isn't catered towards getting your hands dirty or promoting people within your organization who can actually get shit done, you know? And that sort of anti-democratic sort of attitude, or like that type of thing, that's also been the case in Pakistan as well. Like, you know, if I look at the sort of issues that we were like, it was all about control, like 3-4 people having control of the whole organization. and vicious, like who, like, and the other thing is, like, this is another conversation to be had, is that if you look at the old model of like communist organizing, right, workers were essentially put into worker fronts, right? And students were made bosses of the party. And that sort of division where, workers, like people from, like working class backgrounds or whatever, like workers were lifetime unionists, essentially, like it wasn't, they were, and you had like these like PhD types like us, right? Like, like we're like the leaders of like, these radical organization, right? And we're like the intellectuals sort of, and that's a huge problem when your organization model was sort of like, built in that way, that the students, we're going to like make these like communist students, we're going to have study circles, we're going to teach them everything about Marx, Lenin, and all these things, but they won't know anything about what's happening in working class areas, or what's happening in terms of class struggle, what movements, what actions we should do, and those things. And that's why IWW was so effective. Like it was just like, it was able to organize at that time period. Like America in the 1930s, like you guys probably know better, from the late 1800s to like early 1930s, like it was essentially, one of the few organizations that was able to deal with the informalization, or like the lack of, I don't like the term, but like rights or union rights, or like the vicious, like that sort of thing, like sort of temporary jobs and those sort of things, right? And that type of thing. And they were able to like do some very militant actions, in that sense. And I don't know why, I think it was violently put down at the end of the day, otherwise it would have been, it had a potential. And the other thing was, it was so independent. It was like anti-Soviet, there've been movies on this as well, like, talking about the attempt to create a relationship between the Soviet Union and them. But like Emma Goldman, like you had like very, very radical working class figures in that organization, feminist figures, like all these sort of very diverse crowd of figures. And it was multiracial, like, so there was a lot going on there, which I think, when it comes to worker politics or union politics, and like everywhere, like the union, how these unions, like during that period, this was sort of a very different union. I don't think it was, like in Pakistan, in Faisalabad, their power loom workers, they kind of like self-organized. They've done really militant strikes, taken on the state and that type of thing, and they withstood that. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of that, but I don't think, we've gone back to those sort of, that type of organizing anymore, like in that sense.
Okay. There's a lot to pick apart there. I'm going to shift us over to specifics in the United States. But I did want to bring up something. Zara may remember this, but in 2014, before we saw the great shift into the Bernie Sanders campaign, we did see the uptick after Occupy of a whole lot of left movements where there had kind of not really been much before. There'd been some various kinds of anti-organizational activism, but I felt like the entire prior, like my watching the left from when I was part of it in my teens to when I was not a part of it in my early 20s to back when I was a part of it again in my late 20s, was basically a big Murray Bookchin Bob Black fight. With some with actually more liberals just kind of giving peons on one side or the other, depending on the day. And after Occupy, we saw a lot of groups come back. But I was reading Ron Tabor recently, and he said he predicted that after Occupy, we would see the return of ML organizations and stuff like that out of frustration. And the reason why I think this is interesting, I was hoping in 2014 that we would all liquidate into the IWW. Not because I thought the IWW had a particularly good answer to the problems at hand. I'm not a syndicalist. I'm not even kind of a syndicalist. But it is ostensibly not a party, but also does have at least kind of a clear function as a kind of union. And the DSA for me was sort of the worst possible world because it is not a party, but is not a party. So it acts as if it has a party identity, but it is not a party. And so it is very like, what would a program like, for example, if the DSA was to adopt a Macnairian programmatic line, Mike McNair out of the CPGB PCI, for those who don't know who I'm talking about, and had a good program, it's still not a party to enact that. And given that the U.S. is not a, Shar, you pointed out that the U.S. has its own context. For me, one of the biggest contexts we don't talk about a lot is almost all the electoral strategies developed by far leftists were developed for parliamentary systems. The U.S. is not a parliamentary system, not at all, actually. And so it ties us in knots. And this brings me to what I think we've seen right now is, on one hand, we've seen pushes towards more radicalization. I'm thinking about the DSA, trying to prove its anti-imperial bona fides by going to see Maduro. This week, I'm thinking of, the increase in DSAers being okay with internet Stalinist defenders and defending them. On the other side of that, though, what we actually see politically, not rhetorically, not in this internet realm or in these non-binding delegations that people can run Kickstarter campaigns for, what we see is deradicalization and people trying to figure out ways to paint the response to Biden as more radical than it is. I mean, I think the first 2 or 3 months we had this, I guess one of the quickest ways to make money on the internet, unfortunately for you peeps, is to do your daily report on, is AOC betraying us or not? Just TYT style and Jimmy Dore style, right? That's been so much of the dialogue right now. But what answer is there to that? Because if we're honest, the Jimmy Dore forced the vote answer, the most you're going to do is reinvent the Green Party, just call it the People's Party this time. Like it's the same strategy as the 70s Green Party strategy. There's nothing else there. But if you don't do anything at all, it looks like you're doing is revitalizing the center of the Democrats and trying to paint, Zara and I talked about like how it looked like Biden was pushing for neo-Fordism. I actually think that's true rhetorically. Yes, there's people who talk about how neo-Fordism and neoliberalism are all kind of meaningless. It's all into capitalism. I actually do think that you need to puritize capitalism because how it handles declining rates of profits changes periodically, and Marxists have been historically blindsided by that. But what I'm seeing right now is like neo-Fordist rhetoric and some neo-Fordist policy pushing with this big infrastructure plan. But if you read the fine print, there's actually still a lot of neoliberal stuff in there, like asset recycling, which sounds innocuous, and they're using it to get the GOP in on the infrastructure bill. But that's where like they can sublease out public assets to private parties, have them recoup profits, and then recycle it for investment by allowing them to declare bankruptcy on it, and then throwing the cost back onto the government. No, that's not even neo-Fordist. That's like the most pernicious form of neoliberalism. What I haven't seen the left handle this very well, you know, except for occasionally the kind of let's have another third party attempt people to kind of weaponize these failures, but then not propose any actual alternative to them.
Well, you know, we have the same old players on the American left, which is we have the Stalinist types who are concerned about, you know, defending various existing socialist places which they think exist. I don't think they exist, of course. We have the platypus people, the invariance people on the coasts who are, you know, in their little reading groups where they're reading Bordiga for the 50th time. You know, and we have the DSA in these various cities, which has a range of different committees, and we have an IWW, which also has a range of different committees, and all of these groups, you know, many of these groups, I think, have given up on doing what these internet commentators are willing to do, which is prognosticate a strategy for basically the American liberals, you know, for what they should do electorally. You know, those groups are not doing that, and I think for good reason. I don't want to do that either. I don't want to be like Vaush or Jimmy Dore. That sounds boring. That isn't what a Marxist or an anarchist should do. You know, and so I think that we're encountering the same old crop of essentially liberals, but those the Jimmy Dore types or whatever, they've just taken language. They've taken the neo-Fordist language also with Biden, despite not having a changed program. And so I think we just see the same old people using a different rhetoric because I think it's fashionable. And, you know, I think there's something reasonable about Stalinism on a certain level in that they wish there was something real that we could hook ourselves onto, and they're willing to even grasp at China or North Korea or wherever to find something real to grasp onto, real program or something like that. But I think that grasping onto these other states is it's more infantile than the left comms, in that it is a craving for an authority, a legitimation, which you cannot find in this situation of global capitalism that we're embroiled in. There is no legitimation offered by any state for our politics, and to need that is kind of it borders on baleful to me. But that is what people have in reaction to Occupy, to this feeling that there is no real left. And I think they're right. There's no real left, and that's what Tikkun said too. That's what you know, that's what a lot of people are agreeing upon. And so people have all these different reactions to that. And while that's happening, you have the same old liberals being the same old liberals saying, "Oh, if we just control the Congress the right way, finally things will turn out right for us." Well, I mean, that's what they can say. And that's what they've been saying, but now they're going to dress it up in, oh, this is what Lenin said. Oh, this is what Mao said. Like that's what you get from these types and I've even heard that from like the market socialist, mutualist kind of people in the United States who are all very much into Vaush, Jimmy Dore type people as well, you know. And I was happy I like the podcaster Zoe Baker, because she's actually a programmatic anarchist, you know, who got in a debate with some of these pop culture electoral left liberals like Vaush or whatever, and she got into a debate with them. And I've also heard she's a bit reformist, but I give her credit for at least calling attention to these decentralized working class projects, which Sher alludes to, which is both my hope and Sher's hope for a possible future. You know, these decentralized working class based projects, as opposed to these organizations which are run by, and that was my experience of the DSA in Washington, D.C., where I live. It's all these people, you know, who are wearing button down shirts and slacks, you know, and they're getting in like a church or a school room and they're talking about how to bring socialism to the masses, and they're making jokes about historical socialist figures, but then they're cramming ourselves right in the same lobbying doors of Congress one more time. This time it's going to work, is what they think. But you know, and because that was my experience of them, I didn't relate to those people when I was considering joining the organization about 3 years ago when I arrived in my PhD program in Washington, D.C. I wasn't interested in that, you know, and they don't relate to me also because I'm kind of a blunt, you know, a queer kind of individual with further left politics, and that wasn't a good mix with, especially with the DC DSA. But I understand that the DSA also has several committees, and one of their committees is called the Libertarian Socialist Caucus, and that has some left comms, that has some anarchist types and stuff. And so even the DSA has tried to nominally include anarchists in their fold, even though those anarchists, haven't done a whole lot, or even left comms haven't done a whole lot besides, doing what the squad does for the centrist Congress, which is being tokens to get more newcomers to come in, right? And that's also what the IWW has done with its few identity politics defenders in its ranks, is use them as kind of tokens to get more people in recruitment. And so I think you do see that with these left liberals, even in the left organizations as well, as you see that this strategic use of the multiply oppressed class and identity vanguard kind of people who have a broader analysis, that they get used, abused, and dropped cyclically in many organizations and within Congress as well. So that's a huge part of the problem with the current left, is that there are people who see past the contradictions, but that they get used by entrenched bureaucratic social democrats. Go ahead and share.
No, that was really well put. It's just we've talked so much about the DSA. I don't look at DSA as I totally agree with what we're discussing here. But if we take a step back and we look at the to use another Althusserian word, like conjuncture, right? In a certain way, I think what took place after Occupy, obviously, it's just, there's so many ways to look at it. What could have been different? I think you don't fight, class struggle does not occur in election rallies. It's not a spectacle. It's not a sort of thing. It happens in the terrain of praxis. It happens in communities. It happens in factories. It happens, in those places. And, it would have been more compelling, Bernie took a, million-person march. He got arrested or something like that, but these individuals, or the politics we're talking about here, it's not committed to a sort of emancipatory sort of a new alternative or anything like that. It was around the Green New Deal. It was a campaign sort of in that, framed in that fashion. And I think and the results are there. They got 5 or 6 people, the squad or whatever, into office. And I think I just feel that we have to really rethink how we look at class struggle. And the Jimmy Dore phenomena is very worrying, because this sort of class reductionism, which has sort of brought about this sort of alliance between left and right populists, and a sort of a very sort of problematic sort of way of looking at class struggle, and it's actually strengthened the right, in my opinion, in that sense, and and fascist forces within society to a larger level. When we're talking about Jimmy Dore and this increasing sort of masculine tendency that's reemerging, and I wouldn't say reemerging, but a lot of this has to do, the internet was seen as a liberatory space for the so-called left, right? At a certain level, but it, we can see right now, who has control of that, right? And and how can we sort of think about that? And then, what's worrying is that, how it's impacted, and I do think out of Occupy, there was a leftist groundswell in the US. And I think there is, but, to suggest that DSA sort of encompasses sort of the larger leftist groundswell in the US or something like that, I think that would be maybe a little bit too sort of loose to say. I don't think it works that way. But like, I do think that, you know, like when we talk about like general strike, when we talk about direct action, when we talk about, you know, actually, you know, like existing class struggles and sort of new forms of organization, new tactics of organization, even like Occupy, even if we're coming from an anarchist perspective, like Black Bloc, you know, and the anti-nuclear movement and those things, you know, like those are, you know, like different tendencies which have had different questions, which sort of try to address different sort of weaknesses and things like that. And I think, you know, what is really worrying, I think, like, you know, in all of this is that, you know, there was a missed opportunity. I think like there was literally a missed opportunity, which, you know, with the Biden sort of government coming to power and the way, you know, like you have these right wingers and fascists sort of, you know, now I see like over here in Columbus, like there's some independent, you know, like right wing sort of fascist dude like running for office, you know, like, and he's like, I'm with the working class people, right? Like, you know, we're gonna get the jobs back and something like that, you know, like it's just like, it's just really disturbing when you see how mobilized right-wing forces are now, and sort of, you know, and when we're talking about identity politics, like right-wing identity politics has always been sort of way stronger than left-wing identity politics in that sense. And I think like, you know, the center, you know, the center has been sort of where it's at. And I think a lot of people, like conscious people, like in various tendencies, like whether anarchism, whether, you know, like us, like, you know, CLR James, autonomous, Marxist, you know, like communist, left com traditions, like, you know, there are a lot of people who are just like getting disillusioned, burnt out, and those type of things. And I think like, you know, like the George Floyd rebellion, I think like Arturo has done some really good work in sort of trying to reposition sort of what it means to be a left intellectual in today's age, or like a radical intellectual in today's age. And, you know, like we should be engaging with as many different perspectives as we can, and really think about what is to be done, you know, in that sense. And it just reminds me of this unionist friend of mine. He was part of the Railway Drivers Association, and I worked really closely with the Railway Workers Union and in Pakistan, which was, you know, it has a huge history of decolonial struggle, anti-dictatorship struggle. And, you know, like under the hybrid regime over there, like, or actually the inception of the hybrid regime, like, you know, and the increasing state control that was taking place. So it was kind of interesting, like the drivers like did a strike, right? And all the workers campaigned against them. All the different classes of workers campaigned against them, you know? And that was, and I asked him, we were sitting, we were having tea, and he was like, you know, like doing a strike isn't that hard to do, you know, if you have the courage to do it, you know, like no matter what terrorism laws they put, no matter what things they put. And I think like, and we've seen like in certain spontaneous moments, like the ability of people to, you know, like mobilize and sort of, you know, take a stand and create a rupture and create a sort of new, you know, like a sort of like division, you know, which is necessary. And I think like, you know, hopefully, you know, like we can sort of emerge out of this. And I think like, you know, it's very important. Like I used to tell like, you know, comrades in our like groups, like, you know, don't be like, you know, be as like understanding as you can, because like the real battle's on the ground, you know, like these meetings, you know, these like discussions which go nowhere, you know, like they sort of get tiring, and they'll tire you out. Like, you know, the old left has been very, very sophisticated in the way they can sort of carry a discussion for 6-7 hours, you know, and sort of create a sort of, you know, disheartening environment in certain cases, right? And and we have to really sort of reassess or reappraise what happened, right? Like even Syriza, like it was sort of a merger of new left and old left tactics, right? And I think like what's another worrying trend is like the death of like Marxist humanist tactics. There was a time when people used to talk about million-person marches. There was a time when, in certain cases, there were like, grassroots coalitions that in those fashions, right? Like, and what's happened under the war on terror and like these sort of things is space for, political actions is decreasing, whether you're a worker, whether you're like in a community, whether you're in other places, but people are still resisting. And it's not because there's like a central sort of China's there, or like, Soviet Union's there, or, there's like some like ideological center as such. And I think like, we should have discussions about the general strike. We should have discussions about like these sort of things. And I think like it goes a long way, like I think it goes a long way to sort of having serious discussions of like, what is to be done in that sense.
Just another thing to discuss. Sher mentioned our friend Arturo, who has been a member of our collective. He's released a bunch of things on the internet, primarily about the George Floyd uprising, and he's defended the insurrectionary approaches there in his writing. And so I think that he's worth reading as far as someone who sees a decentralized left and sees, the movements last summer as part of that left, and sees the uprising aspect of what happened last summer as an essential piece. And so his writing is worth looking into. And if you listen to our podcast, you'll surely hear us talking to Arturo occasionally.
Yeah, amazing and very radical, like a thinker of our age, another person who's just like committed his life to like becoming like a radical intellectual. And that's really inspiring,
So I'm going to recapitulate a few things for our audience because I think some people have come in late, and while this will be made into a podcast as well, for those who are following us right now, a lot of people reacted in the comments to the use of the word class reduction, or at least a few. If you missed the beginning, it's important to understand that this is coming out of an autonomia or aphorismo context, not out of the liberal context in which that class reduction is used as a slur. By here, we mean reducing the class into one collective image of itself, which ignores all others. In the context of Italy, and for those who want us to go into deep background of this, as mentioned in the beginning of this episode, there's an episode with P.H. Higgins where we go into the history of autonomia and aphorismo. Literally, in the case of Italy and in a few other countries, all union bargaining was done at a national level. And so the needs of individual regions and areas of workers and different sections of workers were not taken into account when doing the bargaining. And it was making both the unions and the socialist parties and communist parties very unpopular amongst many of the workers. And so people who started doing worker studies to see what workers needed and decided that different workers need different things. In America, this is even going to be more true. It's a regionally huge country with long-standing, with many different population groups, with many different needs that has to be addressed. And this does come up in traditional party socialism too, where they talk about, resolving the contradictions of the working class or the contradictions with the proletariat, which we all know are not exactly the same thing, although they're pretty close. It's important to realize that workerism, and that's normally what people mean by class reductionism, the way it is, ironically, is the opposite of the way that it's used in Italian. Aphorismo literally means workerism, but workerism in America has tended to mean, this idea of the worker, of a unified worker that we have a collective image of, that we part to as a kind of ideal form, and we reduce everything to that, and we come up with a proletarian cultural assumptions based off that. And one of the pushbacks I've had to a lot of the discussions of this PMC thesis is a lot of things attributed, a lot of the cultural values attributed to PMC for example, when people talk about trans issues being important or not, it always is in terms of the PMC debates for some weird reason. We find that a lot of these social conflicts actually exist in different forms and in different ways, but they exist in almost all the classes. The exception actually probably is racial issues, which tend to become more intense actually as you move up the class spectrum, interestingly, and it's till the top. That's what the Pew studies indicate. And again, we also have to remember that Pew studies use class in a liberal context. That's the way they define their poll categories. So it doesn't mean the same thing for us, but it is something to note that people on the higher income brackets view racial struggle more importantly and feel racism more acutely and also feel more racist. All those things come across study after study after study. However, some people take that to deduce, oh, well, racism isn't a problem in the working class, which is absurd. And like the Pew studies don't bear that out. It is a problem. It's just not the same problem, and it's not as intensely felt. Because frankly, you have other things to worry about. And so that's the context in which it means here. I know I have to go and do all these long expositions on words when I talk to different interviewees, but people get caught up in these nominal, nomenclature stuff when they miss the context of what we're even talking about. Like, because we're talking about autonomy and coming at the working class as it actually exists demographically, as it exists in itself first. A lot of these other groups, I think, are class for themselves people, but they're not actually really interested in the class in the class that it actually exists, and getting it to act for itself. And they think they know what that means. And as was hinted in the beginning, the over reliance on students and even student entryism has been a problem for the American left. Actually, we tend to blame it on the new left, but I've been doing studies on the early 20th century for a book on Christopher Lashin I'm writing. And it's been an American habit since the 19-teens or maybe even the late 1890s. Like, it's a long trend in the US. It is longer than we think it even is, because we kind of have erased the non-Marxist left before the 50s as even existing, because it's kind of inconvenient, even though many trends from it still exist in America and actually have been spread by American discourse to all corners of the globe and have informed the Marxist left there, even without anyone knowing or acknowledging that it even existed. And that to me is a major problem, particularly right now. I guess lastly, though, to be, again, a little bit more concrete, why Sher indicated that we're seeing a rise of the right, which I see and don't see at the same time. And this is a strange thing to say. The organized political right in America, as it exists in its own institutions, has never been more sclerotic than it is right now. At the same time, it does seem like, if you look at just the raw numbers of something like QAnon, which is a nebulous phenomena that cannot be traced in the same way, but like it is bigger than any one faction of the US left, and that's conspiracy-minded batshittery, frankly. The US left, maybe if all its tendencies all together, including many of its liberal ones, were taken together, we might be the same size as that. And so that should worry us, because just because the GOP is in decline and the organized right in America, which has had a kind of para-hegemonic power to the American liberalism, right? I mean, it's kind of a form of it anyway, but really since the late 70s is just because it looks to be hurting right now, it doesn't mean that the social forces that it's been channeling are going away. And I don't think the U.S. left has a way of talking about that without going into Trump histrionics, you know. Would you like to talk about where you see the right going, particularly as the left? Because if we follow our historical patterns, we can guess that buying something radically changing in the next year, the left will continue on its historical trend, and this uptick that we've seen will decline and lead to, and it will lead to two things, one of which is recuperation by liberals, and the other which is reactionary backlash from former leftists. Like, that is a real thing, and it's happened. It happened in the 60s, and we just don't talk about it very much. Do we see that happening again under Biden? Is that something we're concerned about, or you guys are concerned about? And that may be our final point for the day.
Sher, go ahead. You seem very opinionated about this.
No, I'll let you go first. It's just such a loaded question. I was just thinking in my mind just how loaded the question was, and sort of it just
Okay.
Yeah, loaded questions. Never.
I think this is my opportunity to go on my Adorno high horse of sorts. I've recently been interested in Adorno's critique of occultism. He has the Stars Down to Earth book, which is a book which is very critical of New Age and pagan ideas. And in the past couple of years, I've found myself increasingly surrounded by LGBT people who are all about astrology, tarot, all of those kinds of things. And as you've seen a rise in that, that's when you've seen a rise in stuff like people who don't believe in vaccines, people who think that the schools are making their kids trans, people who think that vaccines are making their kids autistic, people with all of these non-scientific ideas, some of which are indirectly encouraged by corporations and by the capitalist economy. And so that's where I begin to address this issue of QAnon, which is that QAnon, I don't see them as organized. I think you hinted at this as well, Varn. I don't see QAnon as organized. I don't even know that they're necessarily strictly on the right wing. I think that a lot of the Twitter stuff you saw recently about Pride and people afraid of kink at Pride, which is kind of silly to me for them to be afraid of that. That was some QAnon influence on people who would ostensibly consider themselves to be liberal Democrats. Of course, they're all economically liberal, the Republicans and the Democrats, but these are people who identify as liberal and think it means that they're socially inclusive or something like that, right? And a bunch of them are now all of a sudden concerned that these events, which were not for the mainstream, these gay pride events, are now going to affect children. And that's a line directly taken out of this QAnon stuff, where people are constantly seeing in all these places where they're not conspiracies meant to hurt children, which I'm not saying that, all of capitalism has an effect on all working class people, including children, but it isn't like there's these conspiracies either among the gay community or whoever, or, among any of these kind of occultish pagan conspiracies about, they all hinge on these conspiratorial organizations, whether they be the media or the schools or the medical establishment, hurting their children, and hurting their innocence. And so it's this feeling of paranoia, which I don't think is particularly right wing in the formal sense of right wing. I think it ensconces the entire capitalist order. This fear of the damaging of innocence. And you see the QAnon, despite being ostensibly right wing and being one of the bigger powering forces for that January 6th insurrection, which got way further than any leftist has ever gotten in nearly 100 years, mind you. That was powering that. But of course, QAnon is not something that's restricted to the organized Republican Party, not restricted to the organized right. And there's a bunch of Democrats, even people who consider themselves Bernie supporters, who would probably classify themselves as QAnon folks. And so I think, but I do think that all of QAnon and all of this New Age paganism, it can very easily be twisted by populist right-wing figures like Trump, but also like some of these Proud Boy characters or Jordan Peterson or many different right-wing populist voices, they can turn these people and make them, use them. Even use the ones who ostensibly consider themselves to be more inclusive and liberal. They get used by these right-wing populist figures, and I don't know that these right-wing populist figures are necessarily. I think some liberals went above board calling them fascists at points. I don't know that they were always fascists, but they were certainly illiberal capitalists. They were voting a shocking response because they were paleoconservative capitalists that wanted to go back to conservative social values with essentially a welfare state kind of setup, and that's what you get from folks like Tucker Carlson too on Fox News. And so it's worrying how these occult and conspiracy people have assembled across liberal political coalition to defend their fears of essentially forms of liberal modernity and science. They've and these right-wing populist figures have used this wide coalition across liberal politics to attack science, and that's particularly concerning at a time when science is needed to tackle some of the greatest crises that capitalism has created, such as climate change, the pandemic, so these folks are particularly dangerous, but they're not altogether concentrated on the right, and they're an unwieldy coalition that gets used by the right. And so I don't quite agree with Sher myself that the right is growing. I think the right has become, oh my gosh, I'm about to use another postmodern term. I'm sorry, people. The right has become deterritorialized and more postmodern. I was just having a conversation about how Jordan Peterson is postmodern despite hating postmodernism. Like, a lot of these populist figures are postmodern rightists, which means they draw a wide crowd, and they draw an eclectic mixture of things, and then they use that eclectic mixture to conjure huge coalitions out of nowhere to defend random spurts of liberal or illiberal outrage. And so I'm more concerned about that than all of them always doing right-wing things. I'm concerned about these people getting caught up in right-wing cults for moments at a time, not even altogether fascist cults, but like illiberal authoritarian type cults all of a sudden. And I think that the real danger of that is that you even saw that Biden kind of got that kind of a crew on his side, and that's what you see from the kind of Jimmy Dore and Bausch kind of people is a reach of these populist centrist figures into that cross political, conspiratorial, occultish zone. And I think that that's exactly what Adorno was worried about when he was criticizing the occult as having a fascist component, is that we're seeing the seeds of fascism being dusted upon the ground of our political space. I don't think that Trump was a fascist. I think that he was an illiberal capitalist in the style of Theodore Roosevelt. I think he was closer to a paleocon, to be honest with you. I mean, that was at least his rhetoric anyway. And there's a resemblance to fascism of that, but it's not the same. And so I think some of these nuanced distinctions are lost, both among liberals and among the capital L left, wherever it may reside.
Zara, that was an amazing sort of summation of that element of. I think, like, right now the question that we're facing, when we're talking globally as well, like whether it's China, whether it's Brazil, whether it's Pakistan, India, just across the globe, like whatever you call them, nationalists, right-wing populists, and firstly, like, a lot of these people, the thing about right-wing movements or fascist movements, we, especially in my close sort of proximity to researching them and sort of doing it as a journalist and stuff, they play on the terrain of the state, and we should, I think, like, that's where, like, we were talking about Bordiga before. The question was, like, for Bordiga was, should we go with the united left politics above, right? Or, give power to the Soviets, or give power, use general strikes, use, militant actions to confront the state and capital, right? And that was essentially it. The larger conclusion was that, and I think, you know, like I feel that in the current epoch, like you know, it doesn't matter whether, you know, obviously you know, like they're probably like, you know, like, you know, in terms of capital and sort of, you know, state practices or whatever, you know, Biden and Trump, you know, they're very subtle differences, right? You know, in that sense, and I think like you know, Trump just reminds me a lot of, you know, third world politicians, you know, and sort of like a nationalist, very masculine, you know, America, you know, that whole rhetoric around like America first and that stuff, like very pro-white and that type of thing. And I think like, you know, like just, you know, when I think about, you know, the questions for the left and radical politics, we have to, you know, not only, you know, always consistently reassess, you know, like what have been the implications, you know, what is anti-fascist politics, firstly, you know, and how do we combat like political authoritarianism? Because a lot more understanding of capital is pointing to the direction that is moving to like a capitalist and feudalist sort of hybrid sort of system, you know, where you're, you know, like, you know, sort of, you know, like, so I think like, you know, the sort of, and right now Tronti actually wrote an article on terrorism and stuff like that. I mean, the larger conclusion wasn't really a conclusion, but he was raising the point that spaces of agitation and spaces of organizing are, you know, decreasing in certain places, right? Like, especially like where I'm coming from, you know, like, you know, where there is, you know, like Ali Wazir, this major Pashtun leader from the tribal areas of Pakistan on the border of Afghanistan. He launched this really huge movement. He's been in jail for a long time. I've had other comrades in jail, you know, at the border of, you know, Babajan, and other people, and just like, you know, examining that and just sort of thinking about, you know, what role, you know, can we have, like, if we're, you know, like in more sort of settled areas or like civil society type areas, you know, like, you know, we have to, you know, like the question is like, you know, how are, you know, like what is going to be the future of the politics we do, and how do we sort of conceive of a new, like, there's so many elements to it, like, you know, like in terms vis-a-vis like new internationalisms, you know, new solidarities and new forms of organization and those things. And I think like that is the situation right now. Like I think like I think like there, you know, like in the US, like especially like the right-wing movement in the US, you know, it's so related to the state and like that type of thing. It's just like I don't understand it. Like I think like you know, QAnon and these sort of things is also a very, it's just like a weird thing to me. Like, you know, like it's just, you know, such a weird thing because I don't, you know, it's really hard to gauge like how it registers in everyday life and those things. And I think like this like infrastructure and like the way they've been able to do that, I think like for us, it's like important we get away from the online stuff, you know, on a certain level. Like we think about ways like we can organize, do like, you know, on whatever level we can, you know, like I think like, you know, and that's really important because, you know, like we're in academia and I don't want to talk too much about that, but like, you know, Zara and I always have conversations. It's like messed up, like, you know, like how depoliticized and neutralized academia has become in the US, right? And those things, and you know, and you're seeing that like across the board. And I think like, you know, there's so many questions we have to think about. And when I think about like, you know, fascism as a mass movement, like, you know, in Pakistan, there have been like million, you know, like really fascist movements, like in Nazi Germany and that sort of thing. And, you know, so I'm coming from that sort of perspective, and like the relation to like militarization, you know, like those sort of things. And how do we contend with like, you know, these spaces closing up, the greater datafication of protests. You know, we use online platforms to sort of organize, and you know, we're already being sort of, you know, like we're already, we need, you know, like one of my friends, he was talking about, you know, we need to create a black bloc online, you know, like, or something like that, and make that a part of like, you know, activist sort of or organizing sort of tactics and things like that, if we want to do that. And really thinking about what is a militant action that can like sort of, you know, decenter a lot of these like, you know, the new forms of power and control that are emerging within society. And I think like the mobilization, I don't take like Proud Boys that seriously, like, but you know, like there is, you know, they are, you know, this sort of discourse is going into the everyday level. You know, like, you know, there is like a, you know, this, you know, that conservative backlash and that type of thing. So, yeah, I think like political authoritarianism is a key question, and it has to be a key question. You know, whether it's workplace organizing, whether it's community organizing, and those things. And I think like, you know, and I totally agree with what Zara was saying, you know, like in terms of like, you know, defining this, but, you know, these are really difficult questions, you know, but we have to continue to think about it and continue to discuss it and figure out ways to come together to sort of oppose it, you know.
Okay, this is a good point to start. I mean, to wrap it up, I could respond to a lot that was said there. I more or less agree that there's a cycle where when politics tends to fail, where we see occult type things become popular again, and then we start seeing right-wing movements. I think Adorno predicted it in the 40s. We saw it again in the 70s and then the 90s. And we've seen it now. And I think it is interesting how that has also pervaded liberal discourse. For example, I never thought that I would be arguing that rejection of astrology had anything to do with generalized sexism. For example, like those kinds of using, you know, critical theories and standpoint epistemologies to make anti-enlightenment points is something that I think even the founders of those methodologies would be slightly shocked by. I also want to point out Mac Manus, not a person whose politics I actually tend to agree with when he's talking about the left, but when he's talking about the right, has made many of the same points as Zara about postmodernism, despite the fact that it's used as a scare word on the right, that they effectively actually do hold a relativistic epistemological framework. They try to operate in multiple non-related, modalities, and they see the relationships as basically culturally relevant, and there's no scientific check on them whatsoever. So yeah, there are people talking about how they're socialists who are founders of modern med. I realize that it's not a unilateral thing, but the historical trends are actually pretty clear. And as I like to remind people, history is made in aggregate. I'd like to thank you two for coming on. I'm going to ask you one last question that's going to be able to, both of you can answer simply. If you were going to have people start with any episode of your podcast, each Zara and Shard, tell me which one you'd have them start with of the 12 or 13 you got up. It's a mean question, but it's a good one. You muted, Zara.
I would have to find the one, but I really liked. We had a mini debate where we I defended the Bordiga standpoint, and another Arturo defended a more anarchist standpoint, and we debated the value of Antifa on our podcast, which was a really good discussion. That's one of my favorite. I would have to figure out which one that is. And what's your favorite, Sher?
It's hard to say. I mean, you should the episode with Amar, my close comrade in Lahore. He's been facing a blunt of like problems with the state and like authorities, and it's about organizing in Pakistan. That's obviously one I like. Then I also like the episodes we did on like Foucault with some of our comrades in the UK. Obviously, Arturo, the episodes with Arturo are really good, especially on the the articles that they've done. He's done for Ill Will editions. So I think like we've done like a good variety. We're gonna like restart up. We're trying to like get back to the basics, sort of discuss like various critiques and strategies, and classic people like Penokik, CLR James, those sort of things. I think we have a lot to learn from those past sort of icons and militants. So yeah, it's just like an effort, just to do something. And I think like that's one thing about these online platforms, like especially with Zara being in a different city from me, not being able to like discuss things, like hang out and discuss like what we want to do, and those things is partially this is also an exploration for me, at least, like to learn more from each other and sort of build something that can sort of really tip the scales or something in that sense. So yeah, like it's something we're working on, but obviously there are always constraints, and partially lately it's been my fault. Like I've been caught up in some stuff. So
all right.
Thank you so much for interviewing us, Varn. And I love your podcast. I watch it whenever I can, and I hope we have more discussions and we talk again. All right.
Yeah, we probably will. If nothing else, I'll probably show up on your show. And you guys would be welcome back here at another time, probably for a Patreon special or something. But we'll get you back on. I am going to. In this part, I have to do the normal buskering business. You must forgive me. It is part of the world we live in now. And so I'm going to say goodbye to Sar and Shar. Check out their show, Facing Autonomy. I think you'll learn a lot from it. And here comes the boring part where I'm just a giant face for those of you who are watching on the channel. For those of you listening on the Patreon feed, this is just business stuff. One, Patreons will probably be getting a special on Thursday with Camilo on the situation in Peru. Part of that will be available to the public. So about an hour of it will be available to the public, and about an hour of it will be Patreon only. On Wednesday, our guest will be Danny Besner, who will be talking about liberal imperialism, and we're going to be breaking that down. That interview will be later than normal due to schedulings. It's going to be in the evening. So I think it'll probably be about 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Sorry, but that's what I could do. Besner's on the West Coast. That will be it for today. Yeah. So, oh yeah, like and share, like and subscribe. Give me reviews. I need reviews. People need to find it. The algorithms depend on it, particularly on Varn Vlog Voice. I also need to do a patron shout out for our $10 patron, I gave the $10 patrons a name that even I can't say because I decided to pull from Mongolian. Our patron. Trying to remember what name they wanted me to say. Gertha Program's #1 critic has been added to our business. It's been added to our category of Khan Il Kanan. So I have changed all of our Patreon tiers to respond to the historical ranks of the Khanate. So there we are. I will try. The Camillo should be early in the evening. I'm going to try to avoid overlap with This is Revolution. A quick question. I'll answer this question. Varn, in Egypt, did I teach the British curriculum? IGCSE or IB? I taught IB. I taught American curriculum and IB. And that's it. July will be pretty action packed for you guys. After that, we're going to one live stream a week because of my day job starts back up, and we'll have an additional podcast for free. We'll do probably 2 additional free podcasts a month on the podcast feed, in addition to the once a week live stream, and 2 Patreons only, plus what, there's all kinds of Patreon stuff. Like I've said that I was going to give 2 extra episodes a month. There was something, since I was on hiatus last month, I actually gave you guys like almost, I don't know, 20 free episodes. So there's a lot of material. If you join the Patreon, you got access to all of it, but you don't have to. If you can't do that, I totally understand. Just like, share, or review. That's all I really need from you right now, because I want people to hear this. All right. Take care. Good evening. And I hope you have a great day. See you back on Wednesday. Bye.